All right. Hello, everybody. This is Barry, CEO and co-founder at Ivy. I'm super excited for this conversation. I want to thank everybody for joining, and I especially want to thank our guest speakers today, General Charles Jacoby and Leo Tilman. Thank you, gentlemen, both for being here. How are you today?
Doing great. Thanks for having us.
Yes, delighted to be here, Barry.
It's a huge honor to have you both here. And today we're going to be talking about how to navigate the unknown. This is something that for all of us at an individual and organizational level, a key priority. It's at the core of human nature. What makes us human is our ability to deal with uncertainty, think ahead, and ideally do it better. And just for everybody to have full context, we couldn't have two better individuals to help guide us on how we can be better leaders by navigating the unknown better. So our guests include, as I said, General Charles Jacoby. He is a 4-star commander of NORAD, recently retired, and he has led at all levels in peace and war. And he also headed the federal military response to Hurricane Sandy back when that happened for all of our New York-based members who were impacted by that. That's something we've all shared in common. We also have Leo Tilman, who is a leading expert on risk strategy and finance, and he's advised companies, governments, institutional investors around the world. And so we're going to have this incredible combination of views, one from a military organizational perspective, another from a business one, and this incredible thought partnership between Leo and General Jacoby is something we're going to be benefiting from altogether. So to dive in, the first question I want to ask you both is why you chose this topic of agility and how to deal with the unknown as a subject of your book. Why is it so important? And how did you decide on this particular topic as the one to focus on and to share with the world?
Well, again, it's a pleasure to be here. We are excited to speak with you and hopefully make this relevant and useful to the audience. So it's been troubling to both of us from different perspectives that the term agility has been used and overused now in every setting, in business and finance and government, in the military, but it's never been defined. It's never been operationalized. So while every board of directors and every executive team in the public and private sectors talk about the need to become more agile as individuals and as organizations, nobody quite knows what that means and how you would go about doing this in practice. So we came to it from entirely different perspectives, as we will discuss, but the need to introduce almost a theory of what it means to be agile, but then make it super practical is what drove us to write this book.
Got it. And I want to just, well, General Jacoby, did you want to add to that from your perspective?
Well, I came from it from a different angle than Leo. I think the importance is that we found alignment in our thinking from the military side to the business side. And we had what we call in the military a chance contact with each other and discovered common views. I frankly came to concern myself with this idea of agility because it really had become a buzzword in the military, and it usually meant to do more with less, or to do the same with less. It was some kind of mystical response that we were going to have to budget cutting after the Vietnam War, force structure cutting after the Gulf War, and then gutting readiness and acquisition after the Budget Control Act of 2011. And by that time, I was a senior leader, and I said, quit telling me to be nimble, adaptive, flexible, and oh yeah, be agile too, and we'll be okay. And so that's not okay. And it's actually dysfunctional for organizations to have cascading definitions throughout an organization on what the ways are that we're going to approach the uncertainty. For us, the uncertainty of plummeting budgets and plummeting support. And so, in fact, dysfunctional to the point of creating cynicism within the organization, that we're just, in fact, going back to doing more with less. So Leo and I both felt that that we would grab hold of this word agility, that it was much deeper and broader than people have talked about, that it is achievable. You can learn it. It's not a question of DNA, and we wanted to write about it. And so that's why we're here.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I think many of us can relate, constrained resources, got to get things done faster, for cheaper, be agile. But how, and what does that actually mean? So I love how you both had that in common, frustration with how that term was being left undefined, but not just the term itself, but also how to execute on it. So to get us started, I guess what would be really good is to hear your definition of what is agility. And then we can dive into a framework of how to actually implement that in any organization.
So let me start. So agility is so much more than doing more with less. It's also so much more than speed and adaptability and flexibility and all of these other terms. Because agility at the end of the day is the ability to react to change and disruption. And of course, how fast you get there and how adaptable you are from the evolutionary perspective, all angles to it, but it's a broader, much broader topic. And of course, you need to be dynamic and knowledgeable to do that. So we define agility is the organizational ability to detect, assess, and respond to environmental changes in ways that are purposeful, decisive, and grounded in the will to win. And hopefully throughout this hour and in our book, we were incredibly careful to really define what each one of these terms means and deconstruct it into knowledge, capabilities, organizational setting, etc., that facilitate it. So each one of these words is a super loaded word. Another thing about agility is that we define it as a combination of both tactical and strategic agility. Strategic agility is the ability of boards and executive teams to move the entire organizations in different directions depending on what's happening in the environment. We call it moving with the speed of relevance because that's probably the most important thing for organizations. But the same applies to each individual team member and team because in their own quest to implement a strategy or fulfill the purpose of the organization, they too encounter obstacles and surprises in environmental changes. So their ability to do the same on their level is equally important, and that is tactical agility. So we provide the definition and we decompose it into both strategic and tactical.
Thank you so much, Leah. So just to repeat that for our audience, you defined agility as the organizational ability to effectively detect, assess, and respond to environmental changes in ways that are purposeful, decisive, and grounded in the will to win. So there's a lot to unpack there, and I like how you also separate this into strategic and tactical, and you make it clear that this isn't just for executive teams and board members, it's actually at every team, at every level, and probably also for individuals on the front lines who really need to make decisions in real time in a way that would fulfill this definition. So if you could help us kind of understand when you work with different organizations and different teams, when you introduce this concept, what's the best way in which you start, I guess like helping them, what's the best framework to unpack this definition? So it starts with like detecting, assessing. What are some tools? Like let's start with the detection. So the key is the ability to react to change and disruption. And I guess the first is like even being aware of what's going on. So if you could give us like an idea from top down, how we can best think about this, that would be great.
So we make a concerted effort to make a case that in order to be able to detect changes in the environment, you need to really deeply understand the environment first. So we speak quite a bit about what is the nature of the environments in which we operate. And of course, almost irrespective of the industry or the sector that we're in, we operate in highly competitive environments. And that even applies to government agencies and not-for-profit organizations. because they too compete for talent and resources and mind shares. So that's number one. And number two, this environment is also that of accelerating change and complexity. So we really, before we even start talking about what it takes to operate in environments, we really need to understand it. So we approach it from two very different perspectives. One, going all the way back to Karl von Clausewitz and his theory of war, because war and conflict have enormous parallels with any other competitive environment. So we can talk more about that. And another approach is a modern one. It's the study of complex adaptive systems, which also tell us about the mechanisms of how events happen and then affect different parts of societies or economic systems. So we really spent a lot of time doing that, and perhaps I can turn this over to General Jacoby to comment on the environment before we talk more about the process of detection.
Yeah, thanks, Leo. This idea of detecting opportunities, threats, trends is really critical to the military, but I think it's critical to this concept of agility that we've developed. In the military, it's a core competency to collect information and turn it into actionable intelligence. But even though it's a core competency, even though we need to do it, we still find ourselves often behind the trend lines in the environment. I'll just give you a basic example. When we went to Iraq, we weren't ready to deal with sectarianism and ethnic divisions that really became the root of how the conflict evolved over time for us. And what we had to do was reinvent our intelligence collection capability and to go back to school, become more curious about our environment, and to actually resource our ability to understand the complexity of the environment that we were dealing with, so that we could make good assessments and position ourselves to make purposeful, decisive responses to changes in that environment. And so it took us a couple of years actually to catch back up, and we are committed to that capability. So one of the things you'll find us doing today is the whole military is in a state of re-examining the different environments that we should expect, and environments that may surprise us, that we can find ourselves in the future. So Leo's come up with a word that we've adapted for the book, risk intelligence, to describe that, in the hopes that that kind of bridges both the military and the business approach to it. And Leo, I'll let you explain that a little bit.
So when we talk about understanding the environment, we highlight two very distinct challenges. One is a modern one. We're surrounded by infinite amounts of information. And the challenge is actually less about getting that information and more about determining what is relevant and what is accurate. So part of the challenge is that. But another part is universal, and it goes back to the beginning of time. Really valuable information about our competitors, about the environment, is actually not available. And we need to really allocate resources and time and skills to procure this information. So the two challenges really are important today. We describe the whole process as fighting for risk intelligence. Risk intelligence is a term that I redefined a number of years ago to signify the organization's ability to holistically think about risk, uncertainty environments, and really use this information in making decisions. So thinking about the world from the perspective of risk actually simplifies the job of fighting for risk intelligence, because if you know what's relevant to you, your organization, or you personally, from the perspective of risk and uncertainty, it focuses your mind. Another aspect of it, which is important, is once we focus the mind of our organizations about what's relevant to us and what's important, and we dispatch the whole organization to really think about it and look for it, we need to always encourage folks to look for the unexpected, because as Chuck said, that's one of the most important elements of detection as well.
Barry, I want to capture one element that Leo was pulling on here, and maybe we can pull on it a little bit more later. We mentioned it at the start about that we looked at strategic and tactical agility, and they're not really separate. They're connected. They're a part of the holistic approach to agility. But a lot of this information that can become part of our risk intelligence exists at the edge of our organization, out there where we are meeting the enemy, where we are interacting with the populace, where we are working with clients and customers. And so anybody would say, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to resource thousands of people into the fight for risk intelligence. I would say, don't forget that you have probably dozens or hundreds or thousands of people already in contact with the environment. And this will circle back to the business of the type of leadership required and the type of agility setting you need to ensure that that information becomes relevant and accessible to decision makers as we go through the agility process. So at the end, the takeaway for me is that at the edge of the organization, a lot of this information that can become part of your risk intelligence exists. But if those two, top brain's disconnected from the bottom brain, you're not going to know about it, and you're going to miss the unknown unknowns as well as the rest of the uncertainty.
I just want to add that it's such a critical point, and I think we emphasize it ad nauseum in the book. For an organization to be agile, its leaders must be agile, but that's not enough. Its teams must be agile, but that's also not enough. Everybody across the organization, out to its very edges, must be risk intelligent and informed and agile, just because of the nature of the environment that we talk about. So that brings up an important point again about the resources that need to be allocated to it, but also the type of leadership that is required.
Thank you both so much. That's incredibly powerful. And I want to really crystallize, how we can best make this something that we can apply immediately in our day-to-day life. So what I think will help do that is if you could give us a couple of examples of critical pitfalls that you see organization after organization when it comes to detection and being aware of their environment. What are the most common mistakes that are constantly made? So we can, because once we hear you give those examples, I'm sure we will think about how in our respective organizations, we might be making some of the same mistakes. On the flip side of the coin, I'd like you to also share what are the key questions that leaders and everyone across the organization should be asking in the first place to sift, to get to that relevant, highly valuable information that's actually really hard to find. So on the one hand, what's a really common way to be screwing this up that we can all relate to? On the other hand, what is a very practical way in which, what's the question we're even asking? Because it's common sense. We should be as aware as possible of what's important, but how do we actually pull that out? So what should we be looking for? And therefore, what is the specific questions we should be asking in our organizations to our customers, stakeholders, and internally as well?
So the two are closely connected, the two questions that you asked. So let me give one example in the strategic realm and one example in the tactical realm of where organizations fall short of agility. In the strategic realm, it is all symbolized in the following question. For you, the board of directors, for you, the leadership team, what is on your radar screen? What are the things that you are constantly monitoring, that you have identified as useful, that you understand how it fits into your organization? And if something happens, that you have governance and contingency plans and owners to really address it. And for the vast majority of organizations, there are a handful of risks that they really know well, and they manage them, and they're proactive. There are a bunch of other risks that they sort of know about, but they don't actively manage. They either determine that it's the nature of their business, or it's something beyond their control, but they're sitting on those risks and they don't really manage them. And then a whole bunch of other relevant risks and uncertainties are completely missing from you. And if you are in a leadership team or a board of directors, and you have these three categories, you're really exposed. So from the strategic viewpoint, asking this question, what is on your radar screen, and making sure that anything that is relevant to your organization has been identified, measured, thought through, etc., is super important. From the tactical perspective, it's a couple of things. One of them is when you talk to people on the front lines who, as Chuck said, are in touch with the environment on a daily basis, do they even know that gathering intelligence and conveying useful intelligence to relevant decision makers is part of their job? Because they're the ones who will see the most faintest signals on the fringes of the market that may signify something truly important. Now, if they don't know that it's their job to even look for it, if the culture is such that they don't want to be the bearers of bad news or be humiliated, then none of this is going to happen. So all of a sudden, explaining what their role is, what the critical role of these edges of the organization is in the whole process, but then creating a culture where if you cry wolf and it turns out to be false, you will be thanked and celebrated. And then if you bear bad news, again, you will be thanked and celebrated because it's invaluable. That all of a sudden brings us from hardcore skill sets and risk intelligence into the realm of leadership and culture.
Yeah, here's a practical example for you. I think in the NORAD enterprise, I probably had on a daily basis 50,000 people working on the NORAD enterprise. I'm not sure how many cubicles that was. Maybe it's 30,000 cubicles of people in Canada and the United States working on the NORAD enterprise. And we had up at the headquarters, we really had great charts and diagrams and PowerPoints on what our priorities and what was on our radar screens. What were the risks and the concerns on our radar screens, as well as the opportunities that we were looking for. And one of the things that worried me the most was that in the 30,000 cubicles out there, the answer to those questions, or at least hints about those questions, hints about those concerns existed, and there was no way to reach in and get that information, get that intelligence. And so this idea of empowering at the edge of the organization to, first of all, understand, I could go to every cubicle and explain to them, if I went personally, I could go to every cubicle and explain to the Canadian or the American sitting there why their job was one of the most important jobs in the organization. And they'd be grateful to hear that. And they'd be grateful to know in a 5-second burst from me, what were the top priorities or top concerns or top threats on the radar screen that I had. And they would be empowered then to look at their piece of the environment in a totally different way and to be able to communicate it. And I think Leo did a good job about describing the type of agility setting required to do that. But to me, that was the great fear. I knew there were majors and captains sitting there in their cubicles thinking, I have no idea if this is important, and the boss will never see it, and so I'm going to put it in this box as opposed to I'm going to take it to this next level supervisor and make sure it gets up the chain. And I think that to me was a very practical concern, and it drove our organization to communicate within itself in very different ways. And those are changes you can make. The senior leader can start making those changes tomorrow.
Let me give a couple of examples from the business world, which I think will be fresh in everybody's memory. It was the lack of risk intelligence, both strategic and tactical, that led to the demise of Bear Stearns, Wachovia, Blockbuster, and Kodak, and many other companies we know. And we talk about them to various degrees in the book. But there's one company that we present a case study of throughout the book that really did it well, and that was Goldman Sachs during the financial crisis of '08 and '09. And we're not talking about corporate social responsibility or the role of various players in the development of housing bubbles. We're just talking about the internal processes that let companies be agile or not agile. So what was special about Goldman Sachs relative to any other investment bank? And I was at Bear Stearns at the time advising clients. So it was the ability of Goldman Sachs to detect changes in the housing market before anybody else. And interestingly enough, they did it both strategically and tactically. Both the senior management noticed that something was up, but they were also receiving signals from the front lines that things just don't make sense. People are not behaving rationally. It just so happened that at that point, Goldman was one of the only large financial institutions who could truly articulate their portfolio of risks, all the relevant risks and uncertainties in real time. And by putting the two together, they were able to create a plan and then very decisively execute. So we talk about this from a number of perspectives, but in terms of both the engagement of the senior leadership in the study of the environment and people on the front lines, the communication between the two, and then translation it into plan, I think it's one of the most valuable examples we can think of.
Thank you so much. That's an excellent example. And thank you, General Jacoby, also for the example you shared. So just to summarize this, my key takeaway from here is, on the one hand, the leadership needs to be incredibly intentional about what is on our radar, not the obvious stuff that, that maybe we always look at the 2-3 things, but what's the bigger picture of things that we really should be aware of, and then making sure that there's an organizational culture where everyone is also aware of those key environmental considerations of what leadership is looking at, but also there's a culture created where colleagues at all levels of the organization are comfortable to communicate when they see risks, when they see things that might possibly go bad, without fearing that they may face negative consequences for speaking up. So I think that's a very good example. And I just want to ask you very briefly, what generally stops organizations from doing this? Is it just like a failure in leadership to think bigger about the environment? Are they thinking too narrowly on what they do without enough consideration? Or is it more of the time that like this disconnect between the top and the bottom of the organization, where maybe the leadership is more aware and thoughtful about this, but they get everybody else to just do their job and maybe not get connected to the bigger strategic picture?
So let me start. I think the answer to that is so multifaceted, and thanks for asking it. But I'll point to a couple. One is knowledge, and another one is the allocation of resources. So from the knowledge perspective, again, so when we talk about risks and uncertainties, it's the following types of questions. We have an environment of trade wars. What do trade wars mean to our organization, to our business? Have we thought through it? What if they intensify? What if they engage other numbers of players? You have dramatically evolving and rapidly developing several fields of knowledge, like quantum computers, gene editing, artificial intelligence. How would quantum computers affect our organization? How would gene editing affect our organization if we're an insurance company or a healthcare provider or a municipal government? And that goes to the fact that everybody's consumed 24/7 with the day-to-day tasks and execution. And what we hear from boards and directors, but all the way to town halls of organizations, is that stepping back and thinking broadly about this environment and really saying, we need to allocate time and resources to doing that, is considered to be a luxury. When we're so busy and we're so tired of day-to-day execution, should we really spend additional amount of time and resources to do that? Many companies don't. And one of the fascinating conversations that General Jacoby and I had was about the role of leadership to make that case, and to make that case both to themselves, but also to the entire organization about this being an essential priority.
Right, absolutely. So, do you have a rule of thumb on, if you were to tell an organization, hey, here's a good rule of thumb of all the resources and time allocation that you have, or resources of people, and like what they should be doing with their time? Would you say it's really like 5% of people's time that they should be spending on this, like the bigger picture, or is it more like 20%? I know maybe this is like a silly question to ask, but like, to think about, because we're all stretched super thin by the things we absolutely have to do that seems urgent day to day. But then it's these bigger things that can really kill or make an organization. So what is the right kind of amount of percentage resources to allocate to this and go on an ongoing basis?
Hey, Leo, can I take a step?
Of course, please.
Yeah, I don't think it's a silly question at all. I think it's a fundamental question, and I think it starts with I do some coaching and mentoring for brand new general officers, flag officers, and the first thing that I learned and that I pass on to them is that senior leaders need to focus first on the things that only they can do for the organization. And it's obvious, but it really always makes a general officer stop in their tracks and say, okay, what is it that only I can do in the organization? And it starts with, well, first of all, General, you're the only one that can pick up the phone and call another general. That's number one, and get things done. And you're the only one that can talk to the boss, maybe the Secretary of Defense or maybe the chairman, and so you start deconstructing what is it that only I can do, and when you focus on that and make sure that, and here's another thing that only a senior leader can do. Only the senior leader can set the vision and the priorities for the organization and determine and live what the culture is going to be. If they don't do it, somebody else does. And it could be somebody in the mailroom, or it could be somebody at the edge of the organization is going to, start developing their own culture out there. And so that is plenty of work for a senior leader to do. And then I would say the other within that realm of what else is it that only senior leaders can do? Only senior leaders can determine, I'm going to take this chunk of time and understand the relationships and understand the environment and understand what winning means, and then empower my subordinates and empower out to the edge of the organization folks to execute in the way that I would want them to. If you're so engaged in the knife fight that you can't do that and you can't focus on the things that only you can do, then you haven't empowered sufficiently in the organization and defined roles and responsibilities sufficiently within the organization. And I know that CNN's going to drag you into the knife fight. Every little thing's regulatory things are going to drag you into the knife fight. You have to resist it, and you have to empower, or the rest of these must-do senior leader things won't happen.
Let me expand on what General Jacoby just said from a slightly different perspective. So we devote an entire chapter in the book to the topic of what business are you in? And of course, you can ask this question of an individual or a team or the whole organization or a country. And it comes off as so self-evident and obvious, but then when you dive into it, it's incredibly complex. It's incredibly complex strategically. It's incredibly complex operationally. So another way to approach your question is to say, what time should we allocate to that? And then devote time to resolving this question. So for instance, how much, given the business we're in, how much time should we allocate to execution? How much time should we allocate to R&D? How much time should we allocate to stepping back and thinking deeply about our environment? Is stepping back and thinking deeply about our environment is the business we're in or not? Because if we are, then we need to allocate time and resources in the same way. So of course there is no formula. However, having this discussion in rigorous terms on a senior level will force the organization or a team or a leader to answer these questions. And that provides amazing clarity. It also engenders buy-in because you've explained the rationale of the business you're in.
I love that. So combining what you each said, on the one hand, instead of like trying to put like a random percentage on it, it's really about intentionally asking the question, how much of our time should we be there, during the day-to-day, and how much of our time, given our organization, right? So if we are a business that's, at the cutting edge of the genetic revolution, genetic engineering, probably there's more like needs than another organization maybe that's just doing the same old thing. So there might be different levels, but at least being intentional about it, and then together with buy-in from your colleagues, deciding, okay, whether it's 1 out of every 5 days or 1 out of every 10 days, whatever it may be, to assess that. And then from a senior leadership perspective, as General Jacoby said, it's like you got to spend almost all your time on the things that only you can do, because if someone else can do it, why are you doing it? Like, that's a huge waste of time. So I guess it's like understand. So it's almost like, well, 100% of the things should be the things only you can do, and I guess that cascades down the organization as well. So I thank you both for providing those examples. In your definition, one thing of agility that really struck me, and I think probably I'm going to guess that it strikes most people as like a little bit unexpected there at the end, is this phrase around, grounded in the will to win, right? So you start from something that actually sounds very like, academically chain, and then it's all of a sudden there's a talk about purpose and a will to win that almost transcends the functional, and there's something that goes above and beyond. Can you tell us a little bit about this? Because I'm imagining all kinds of companies with hundreds of people doing research and so on, but like there isn't maybe like the kind of almost like the spirit of what you're trying to do, like the real purpose behind it. It's so critical. So tell us a little bit about what takes, let's say at Goldman Sachs, there's a whole like, okay, we have the numbers, we have the research, but then there's this like willingness to actually do something about it and go all the way. So if you could drill a bit down into that, that would be very helpful for us.
Sure. Well, again, in the will to win, in the definition, goes hand in hand with purposefulness, right? Because one of the things that we emphasize goes all the way to the study of the impact of evolution and intentionality on human development. This goes way back. The ability to create a purpose and unify a group or organization around a purpose is one of the most important things. That's what creates excitement and engagement and trust, but also cohesion in doing it, right? So one of the ways we describe it, and we borrow the term from Bill George and others, is a strategic and moral true north. What is the direction, and what are the values and standards of behavior that unify us around all of this? So that is an important aspect of it, because it then feeds into this will to win. Will to win, not surprisingly, is a loaded term too. And we sort of talk about various components of it. One is an obvious one. You need to have perseverance and ability to overcome challenges and resilience to be an organization. That's part of the will to win. Another one is you need to have a bias for offense, meaning you are constantly looking for opportunities to go on the offense, to grab the initiative, to be in control of events rather than being dominated by events and being constantly reacting. To us, this is the key difference between, for instance, agility and adaptability. But the third one is more nuanced, which is if we say that our actions and strategy are grounded in the will to win, we are immediately forced to answer the question of what does winning mean to us? And all of a sudden that opens again an entirely very, very rich conversation about our purpose, our mission, our strategy, the business we're in, etc. And the moment you phrase it that way, all of a sudden it's not just applicable to military organizations and business organizations who are in zero-sum games. It's applicable to any organization, because for them, winning may be influencing public debate about an important issue, or converting policy into societal change, or whatever the case may be, right? So properly deciding what winning means to us is a very powerful way to do that, and it makes the concept of agility applicable to any organization.
Yeah, and just to tap a couple times on some of the things Leo mentioned, this business of initiative is critical, and especially in uncertain environments. You're out there studying the environment. You're looking for opportunities as well as looking for threats. And if you give in to the natural bias during an uncertainty of inaction, then you will always be behind. You will always be reacting. And we think that's the antithesis of agility. Agility is about purposeful, decisive response that advances the goals and objectives of the organization, whether it's a military organization. And win also just frames it in the reality that we're talking about competitive environments. And so, we purposefully put it in there for that reason. We know it means different things to different people, but it comes down to purpose. And I will tell you that if you think about the US military, we don't have the normal quiver of incentives to motivate folks. We really can't. We have a system for promoting you. We have a system for paying you. We have a system for this, that, and the other thing, and you really can't change much of that. We incentivize with purpose and the nobility of the purpose and the importance of the purpose. And I think, and in conversations with Leo and others, I think that understanding the purpose and understanding the role that each individual and each team plays in accomplishing that purpose is powerful. And that's why we went ahead and threw that in there. And we want people to wrestle with it, and we want them to challenge us on it. But it really differentiates agility from a whole bunch of other words that don't add up to meaningful courses of action for organizations or leaders.
Let me make two very quick points. One is the recent action by the Business Roundtable to redefine the purpose of the corporation lives exactly in this realm, because we have had a tradition of saying that delivering returns to shareholders is the primary purpose of the corporation, and all of these other things matter, but they're not primary. So by redefining the purpose as is the ability to serve various kinds of stakeholders, from employees to environment and society, as well as shareholders. In our terms, business executives just redefined the definition of winning and the will to win. And that is a direct link between these recent events in a broader realm of ESG with agility. To elaborate on what Chuck just said, this bias for offense as a key differentiating quality of agility relative to resilience or dynamism or flexibility is a fascinating conversation. We've seen this in daily news headlines. Amazon is expanding into yet another business, and Google is developing driverless cars, and CVS just bought Aetna. All of these actions, by expanding into businesses and doing new products and transactions, are companies grabbing the initiative and redefining the competitive field. In a totally different example, we spent quite some time in the book talking about the case study of Putin's Russia and its intent to destabilize Western democracies and undermine trust, etc. And if you study Russia from this perspective, it's been incredibly agile, and it kept the initiative and put everybody else on the defensive. And there is a lot to be learned about it, both in terms of foreign affairs, but also in managing any organization. So you can think about the will to win and its components is one of the most important elements of agility, but it all is grounded in purposefulness, which is a combination of moral true north and strategic true north.
Could you actually elaborate on that? So moral versus strategic true north, how would you differentiate between those two?
So strategic true north in the vocabulary of US military is commander's intent. It's the explanation of our purpose and strategy, and specifically how we're going to get there, right? And in the US military, one of the essential responsibilities and roles of a commander is to develop that strategic vision, and then how they call it, help it visualize the unfolding of this entire operation with its many people involved and multiple lines of business converging and so on. Only senior leaders can do that. But unless the organization fully understands our purpose, our vision, our strategy, and what all of this means to them, right? They're not empowered to exercise initiative and be creative. The moral true north is our values, our standards, right? So when we adapt into new environments and serving our customers and developing new products, what are the values that remain unchanged? What are the values that define our organization? Because those are the ones who will inspire our people, keep them cohesive, keep them engaged. So the two go hand in hand, but without that clarity about the morality of our organization and us as leaders exemplifying it, as well as the strategic direction, very little can be achieved.
Well, you can also let the organization get off track, and in ways that can't be recovered, and you can destroy your brand and the trust that people have in whether it's the Army or in organizations or institutions. And so, without the moral true north being your anchor point, you need anchor points. Even in a dark room filled with uncertainty and scary things, you need anchor points to hold on to as you make your way through that uncertainty, and that's your moral true north.
We use an example from the financial industry in the book about the company that we worked with. We could not name it for obvious reasons, but the company was very successful, and then it just imploded during the financial crisis. So we were brought in by the board of directors to try to understand what exactly happened. And of course, there were elements of strategic true north that were missing. The company was created for one purpose. The market environment was not suited for that purpose. So they changed it, but that transition was not well thought through, and organization didn't fully understand it, etc. And when we went in, we expected that will be 99% of the conversation. What are the market forces? What are the environment? What are the strategic issues that led to the demise? Instead, that occupied 5% of the time. And 95% of the time was devoted to the collapse of the moral true north within the organization and the failures of leadership that actually led to all of this. So it was one of the most interesting case studies for us to see how the two sides of true north, strategic and moral, interact, but how moral can completely overpower everything else.
Yeah, just a quick example that is a risky example for us to talk about, but I believe we lost our moral true north in how we treated prisoners in Iraq. And it took years to recover from that. There were really good strategic reasons, really good strategic excuses, but we lost our true north in who we were as American soldiers and paid the price for it for years, recovering breakdowns in trust and confidence.
Thank you so much, General Jacoby, for sharing that. I think for all of us, we can relate when, in our conception, we're trying to be agile. It's important to get this information. It's important to do certain things. But I think the moment it crosses the line where it impacts people's ability to believe in the moral true north, when it's so contradictory. And I guess this is, not just in policy or the military, but also in every business. There's always, expediency, sure, but at what price? And if it's actually contrary to certain moral true norths, it can be massively damaging to the company. So throughout this conversation, before we started and dived into the conversation, I shared with both of you that we really want to cover like key questions that all of us, everybody at Ivy, these incredible leaders who are only going to have more and more responsibility as the years go by, what are the key questions that they should keep in mind? So throughout your different responses to the areas we discussed, I compiled a list of questions that might maybe serve as a bit of a like calibration tool for everybody. So I'm going to quickly summarize them, and then if there's anything else that would be really good as a question to keep in mind for people, I think that will be really important to hear from you before we wrap up. So with no particular order, but just in the way in the order that we discussed them, a key question you challenge us to ask is making sure that as the leadership of an organization, as the leaders in an organization, we need to be extremely intentional about defining what are the key things we monitor, and don't pigeonhole ourselves too much in the 2-3 things that are blatant, but what are some of the bigger ones? So asking that question, like what are the key things that absolutely should be in our radar that we closely monitor on an ongoing basis? Second question, once we have that in our radar, is everyone in our organization aware that those are the things we should be monitoring? And not just the leadership and the managers, but actually everyone, especially those who are interacting, at the front line, whether that's with your customers or whoever's really in the environment, seeing and hearing things firsthand. Third question, being intentional about, as an organization, asking the question, how much of our time should we be spending on executing on the mission? And how much of our time should we be focused on really reflecting on what is the mission and has the environment changed, like the bigger picture things, the recalibration. So for every organization deciding, how much of that time should be allocated and having the buy-in. And then specifically for leaders, really reflecting on what is it that we can do that no one else can do, and really making sure we spend almost all, if not all of our time on those things. Then we switched gears and started talking about really defining this willingness to win. So defining asking ourselves, what does winning mean to us? And not just in a room by ourselves in our head, but actually as a team, as an organization, really defining what is winning, and then what is purpose for us? Where are we around? It's very hard for any employee in any organization from one day to the next to be like, oh, how do I maximize shareholder value? That's very hard to connect with. But thinking about larger purpose and impact on why does the organization exist in the first place for its customers and broader stakeholders, having that top of mind is a key question. And then finally, do we have a bias for offense? Just being very blatant about that. Like as an organization, looking in the mirror and being like, hey, are we constantly reacting to things, or do we have a bias for action? And if we don't, what can we do about it? And then finally, the last 2 points. What's our strategic true north? Where this quarter, this month, what are we doing? How do we visualize that? What does success look like? But then what are the things that never change, right? The moral true north. So I think those are a whole bunch of questions, close to 10 of them. We'll send that out also with the thank you message, but that's just my kind of, filtering of like, if I had to narrow down and make sure I remembered some things from this. What other questions are key to ask if you had to frame it that way that weren't included in that list that you think are absolutely critical, whether it's to do with agility or just general leadership too, like in your broader experience?
Chuck, do you want to start or should I?
Sure. There's a couple of core competencies that we think organizations need to exhibit to be agile, and we didn't really get a chance to talk to them. One of them is planning. I loved your comment before we got started. You went to Gettysburg, and one of the things you learned, that you like that phrase, make haste but slowly. The but slowly piece of that is studying the environment and planning, and then planning contingencies on what if and what next and what else should I know is part of the move slowly. But it allows you to make haste, which I would say make haste decisively and purposefully. And that's what Meade and Lee were hoping their organizations would do on day 1 through day 3 of Gettysburg. So we didn't really mention planning. In the United States military, it's a core competency. In other places, I know it's considered overhead, but I really do think that leaders have to give some thought to where and to what extent planning needs to exist within their organizations to truly be agile. The other is leader development. I think that I don't think you can outsource leader development. I think leader development starts at the top. It starts with senior leaders, managers, mid-level managers, living the prescriptions that they hand out on what they want the culture to be and what they want the forum of truth to be and what's true north strategically. And they have to live it and they have to be engaged. And that doesn't mean they have to be the most charismatic or the best looking. I mean, geez, look at me. I made 4-star Joe. And they just have to be genuine. They have to be genuine. They have to care. They have to engage. And they have to live what they say is important and live the priorities. And so those are a couple of things that I would always like to throw in there. And I think there are things that you can start working on tomorrow. And this business about a bias for action, you want a bias for action? Empower your teams with resources, guidance, authority, and trust. Let somebody fail and give them a hug. And you just empowered out to the edge of the organization a bias for action. And you can do that tomorrow too. And you can be very purposeful in your approaches to doing that. So Leo, I'll turn it back to you.
So since you are in the very concrete, what can we do tomorrow mode? Let me make the following suggestion. Over the next month in your organization, allocate 4 hours, 1 hour a week, to answering the following questions. And you will observe, I think, a fascinating conversation that will bring up a whole bunch of totally unexpected questions, but also areas that we don't really know. So question number 1 is, what business are we in? As an organization, as a leader, or as individuals? You will see just how multifaceted and complex this is and how it links to every single thing we discussed today. The second question is, are we decisive, both strategically and tactically? When something happens, there's a change, there's a threat, there's an opportunity. Can we react in time? Can we make hard decisions? Do we have the courage? Are we empowered? That's super difficult. And the third question is, do we have a culture of truth and trust at every level? And by truth, I mean, we are not afraid of bearing bad news. We voice dissent during our meetings. We use evidence-based decision-making when we think about things, and that kind of thinking that is directed at the pursuit of truth overpowers formal authority and agendas. I think these types of questions are incredibly useful before we even do anything as an organization to make it agile. Just deeply thinking about these issues, questioning how do we really do in that, and then illuminating this reality is by itself incredibly useful.
Yeah, hey Leo, here's a point that we've kicked around a lot, and I haven't heard it come up yet in the last couple of times we've talked, and that's, you can't outsource agility to a bunch of young folks locked in a room and, you know, fed boxes of pizza. That's not going to create an agile organization. Really, it's the connection between the top brain and the bottom brain, and it's really trying to achieve agility throughout the whole organization. You don't have to get 100%. You know, just as a rule of thumb, you were asking for rule of thumbs. I always thought that, you know, when I commanded in Iraq, I had 135,000 men and women spread across the country. I figured if 85% of them understood the purpose of what we were doing, the big purpose, understood their role and their fight, and they trusted us to not, cut their heads off if they made a mistake, and we trusted them to act, take action, and execute within our intent. We were doing really well. I'd take 15% failure for 85% success. I'm sure I would change that equation based on consequence, vulnerability, and likelihood. But I would not start rearranging deck chairs the first week of trying to become a more agile organization. I think it's more profound than that.
Got it. Thank you so much, General Jacoby, and thank you, Leo. This was incredibly valuable. A lot to unpack there. I want to encourage all of our members to check out your book. We'll be sending a link out after this call as well. So it's called Agility: How to Navigate the Unknown and Seize Opportunity in a World of Disruption. And I know I, for one, will be reflecting very heavily on everything we discussed starting today. And Leo, those questions, the initial questions that you suggested that we do, like sitting with our organization and teams, just spend 1 hour a week for 4 weeks just to ask, hey, what business are we in? Are we decisive? And do we have a culture of truth? I think that's a perfect place to start, alongside getting maybe copies of the book for our respective peers, bosses, and subordinates. So thank you both so much, and looking forward to supporting you in every way that we can.
Thank you very much. It was such a pleasure.
Thanks. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you both, and thank you everybody for dialing in. See you all again soon. Take care.